Hey, this is Blogging Heads. I'm Harry Siegel with the New York Daily News. I'm here with Azi Paybarah, the City Hall man from Capital, New York, and we're talking the mayoral race and 2013 in New York. So, Azi, we're something like 100 mayoral forums in. It feels like more. We've had Anthony Weiner and Carlos Danger. And for all that, in a lot of ways, we seem to be somewhere like where we've started in terms of where the field is. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the revelations that Anthony Weiner continued sexting with various women after resigning from Congress for sexting various women means the mayor's race is basically where it was before he got into the race, which means Christine Quinn is the front runner with a number of detractors. It means Bill Thompson is the underrated contender. He's the only black candidate in the race, and he's expected to get a large number of votes from black and Latino voters. And then you have Bill de Blasio, who's found a niche for himself in the progressive community, offering himself as like the lefty candidate that Democratic primary voters usually say they want, or at least pollsters believe they want. And then you have John Liu, who is like a very energetic candidate who was dogged early on by questions about his fundraising, and he's a very energetic campaigner, most packed schedule of anyone running, but his poll numbers are like lagging behind, and he sort of dismisses that by saying polls are notorious for undercounting like non-English speakers, which is his base.
So let's go back to Thompson for a minute. Mm-hmm. Thompson was the city controller before Liu. He's the former president of the Board of Ed, which is not actually like being the head of the schools.
No, it's definitely not.
But a guy who's filled a lot of roles in New York, who ran against Bloomberg in 2009 and did better than expected, and has always had this turtle in the hair sort of running philosophy, which has something to do with the idea, at least, that you have a number of black voters in the city who are a large block who turn out, who don't tend to tune in until late, who, right, frankly, in a lot of ways you could call low information voters who don't materialize until later. And he gave a fairly significant speech. He gave a fairly significant speech today about George Zimmerman and profiling and stop and frisk, in which he was a much louder, more aggressive voice than he's been up till now or usually is. Is this the moment where he's trying to make his move?
Well, people are wondering, when is he going to make a move? When is his move going to be apparent? And when you ask him about his poll numbers, he dismisses them and says, look, they were wrong in 2009 and they're going to be wrong this year. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, when does that become a problem for him? And I had written something at Capital New York that said, look, don't underestimate the guy, but at some point, the other campaigns are going to start dismissing him if he doesn't show movement, momentum, something. And around the time I published that, the Wall Street Journal published a quote-unquote like internal leak, an internal poll that was like somehow leaked to them about how well his numbers are. And one of the things that poll said was that he's doing pretty good among black voters. And shortly afterwards, a Quinnipiac poll came out showing he was doing pretty good among black voters, but also that he would win in a runoff against Quinn or Weiner.
Well, Weiner had also done very, very well among black voters, right? Like up until Carlos Danger, I believe he was ahead of Thompson among black voters. At least those who were responding to polls at this point.
Right, but I think a lot of people dismiss that, at least initially, as Weiner just having higher name recognition. Now, higher name recognition is what a lot of these polls are picking up, and the question was becoming, why does the guy who almost beat Bloomberg 4 years ago have such low name recognition? And it goes back to what you said, low information voters, people aren't tuning in, and at some point, that stops becoming a plausible excuse, and it starts becoming a problem for someone. If you let the clock run out, then you don't have enough time to move the ball down the court and toss up a Hail Mary shot. The speech today.
Or a touchdown.
I hate exactly my sports metaphors, which only says how much time I've been spending covering politics. Exactly, on the 1 yard line. The thing about Thompson's speech today was that it for the fact that he's the only black candidate in the race. Now, the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman verdict had came out a little while ago. I believe earlier this month. Then there was a large rally the week following the verdict, and now here is Thompson coming out a week after that, talking about it at a black church. Now, what's happening between the verdict and the speech today was an enormous amount of attention paid to other candidates not named Bill Thompson, Anthony Weiner and Elliot Spitzer in the comptroller's race. So this speech, the substance of it was to bring people's attention back to the issue of stop and frisk, but politically also to remind people that this was Thompson sort of clearing his throat and note that he, as the only black candidate in the race, has a significant perch by which to speak on certain issues. And the Washington Post story about the mayor's race before Anthony Weiner's implosion had a line in there from Jason Horowitz who said Thompson hasn't neglected to play identity politics and sort of remind people that he's the only black candidate in the race. And this came up when Christine Quinn had used the phrase environmental racism to describe the reasons for supporting a controversial marine transfer station with which to move garbage to reopen or to open on the Upper East Side. And Bill Thompson opposed it. And Bill Thompson opposes it by saying, look, there's a lot of low-income residents around here, and we should really think about relocating it. And Quinn and supporters of it say that for each borough to sort of take control of their own garbage disposal, you need to open a facility in Manhattan, and anywhere you pick in Manhattan, there's going to be people that complain about it, and this is the best alternative. And they a back and forth, and when Quinn used the phrase environmental racism to sort of describe the inequity that this plan was correcting, Bill Thompson held a press conference, took great offense to it, and it was a reminder that you can't be as loose with your words, and you can't create the opening for a candidate who's relying on a large number of minority voters. There are certain fault lines of phrases that allow them to sort of take the high ground and sort of energize their base and their voters.
So how did Thompson respond to that, to take said high ground?
By saying, no one is going to tell me that, no one's going to use the phrase racism or racist to describe me and my policies. I take great offense to it. I'm a black man in New York City in 2013, and I'm not going to take this kind of language. When he actually parts out what she had said, she never used the phrase environmental racist, which is what Thompson took great offense to. She used the phrase environmental racism to describe historically what's been afflicting black and brown communities throughout New York City. You just open up the book, The Power Broker, to any page, and you see examples of that. When the city was laying out infrastructure, when the city was laying out where to put facilities that detrimentally affect the neighbors around them, they were going into black communities, Hispanic communities, low-income communities, and they weren't going to places like the Upper East Side. So when Quinn had said that phrase, environmental racism is the problem, and opening up a facility on the Upper East Side would correct it, Thompson people took an opportunity to not only draw a contrast on policy, but it was also an opportunity for them to talk about race and identity politics. So
with Weiner's latest meltdown, despite his insistence that today is a lot like yesterday, which may be true in ways other than how he means that, it looks like back to where we started. And right now, I think the smart money has continued to be on a Thompson-Quinn runoff. And what's interesting is Quinn has been sort of the leader of the pack throughout, outside of the brief stretch where she was eclipsed by Weiner. But it seems like it would be very complicated for her to get through a runoff. What do you see? So basically, you've got a 5-candidate field, and assuming no one gets to 40%, which is the wide expectation is that nobody will, you have a 2-week period where the top two face off against each other. Almost certainly, the Board of Elections will screw this up. They've got an impressive track record in New York of screwing this up. Mm-hmm. And already have sort of admitted they're not going to be able to reset all the machines in time. They're going to bring older machines back out. But leaving the mechanics of it aside, how do you see that playing out with Quinn against either Thompson or de Blasio?
It's interesting. So the primary is a 5 or 6 or 7-way race, depending on on who you're counting here, it's primarily like a 6 or 7 way race about, in broad brush strokes, it's one candidate claiming to be the continuity candidate, Quinn, versus 5 or 6 other people who are claiming to be change candidates, right? Everything from Bill Thompson, who's like a moderate change candidate, to a John Liu, let's change every single thing just because it has Bloomberg's name on it, right? And
so just to jump in there, Chris Quinn is the council speaker, and right. She's now had 3 terms on the council, despite a 2-term limit that was overturned, which is how Bloomberg ends up running again in 2009. And Quinn pushes this through the council and sort of forges, in the course of doing that and through other moves, a very close relationship with Mayor Bloomberg. And necessarily, the council speaker almost always starts these elections as the front runner, and historically has not done terribly well for as long as we've had council speakers, because you're in a weird position where you're running, in some ways, as something new, but you are necessarily a continuity candidate. Right. It's a job that demands working with the mayor, who has considerably more power than the speaker does.
Right, and remember, her predecessor, Giffen Miller, was a person who was a Bloomberg antagonist, who spent his entire term finding ways to oppose the mayor, block the mayor, and they had a very contentious relationship. And Quinn saw how that ended, and the gamble was that if she worked with the mayor, she could use that perch of getting things done, accomplishing things. And what's interesting is that Bloomberg's base, the Manhattan, upper middle class, educated, like New York Times reading voter, that's a large constituency, and her base and Christine Quinn's base in the West Village, progressive Manhattanites, that's actually a subset of Bloomberg's constituency. So the fact that they found common ground is not as radical as people would think, given the fact that on a municipal level, you're not dealing with some certain national hot button issues, but what we're really dealing with is a distribution of services and some questions about taxes, and they found a lot of common ground to work on. So therefore,
right, and so that common ground is why you have this one candidate of continuity, and everyone else running in various ways. As here's how I would change the direction of the city. Right. So in a runoff, when you've got 6 people in a race and you've got one part of the field to an extent to yourself, leaving Weiner aside for a minute,
right.
You have a strong base of support. But running one-on-one, there's a reason everyone else is crowded onto the other side of the field. And it's pretty likely that a lot of that support in a Democratic primary is going to coalesce around the opponent, particularly if it's Thompson, who comes in both as a black candidate, who's going to have strong African-American support, and as a guy who has spent time forging alliances with the ultra-Orthodox and the Hasidic communities in Brooklyn, which are large block votes, who really vote as their religious leaders tell them to, who are politically very plugged in at this point.
Right. So in the primary, what you have is one continuity candidate versus 5 or 6 who are arguing for a change election. Now, Bloomberg has polled well among Democrats, and what that means is if you have a candidate who's aligned close to Bloomberg, they start off with a better than expected base of support, given how well the city's running, how well it's moving forward. Despite complaints about stop and frisk, despite complaints about rezoning and gentrification, for the most part, people are happy with where the city's going. They can get to work pretty safely. They actually have a job. It may not be as great as the one that they want, but things, for the most part, are moving in the right direction. People are generally happy with. Which is
why we're not talking about the Republican field at all, because Republicans in New York demand some sort of crisis moment to have a shot, since they are massively out-registered. Right,
and Bloomberg does not actually qualify as a crisis, despite what some places may try to indicate. So in the primary, Quinn has a good level of support, but the problem is once you take away all the candidates and just leave her against one opponent, who represents a broader swath of the electorate that is looking for a change from Bloomberg, not necessarily a change from his policies as directly, but definitely a change in tone, personality, priorities. She then becomes outnumbered. That's what a lot of the numbers are showing. Now, unless she's able to sort of triangulate and co-opt some of the detractors of hers and distinguish the fact that she has enough of Bloomberg's priorities and agenda while also separating herself and carving out a new path for the city. It's sort of hard to see where she gets the support and the votes to get past Thompson in a runoff. That's just looking at the numbers, as we've seen throughout this election, anything can change at any moment. But if you look at the numbers in the polling, that's what it would indicate.
So of course, 2 weeks is a very short stretch of time, and there'll be a lot of money spent, and you never know with outside events.
Right, and money spent by candidates, but also money spent by independent expenditures by outside groups also.
Right,
is a potential.
Which is a brand new equation in New York. We're going to see how it plays out really for the first time in this race. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about a change in tone from Bloomberg, but what strikes me about Weiner and how he surged in the polls is that these candidates have come in this sort of stale, low-interest primary where there have been endless forums of conversation, and yet most voters haven't paid all that much attention. They've all been party functionaries and sort of regulars who waited their turn and did city jobs. So Weiner, of course, was a congressman, and so coming in from slightly outside of that mix. And that they were fighting for and divvying up the base Democratic support groups, municipal unions probably foremost among them.
Right.
And that left all of these sort of unrepresented voters who are Democrats for Weiner to pick up with this sort of endless mantra of middle class, middle class, middle class. That in a lot of ways is very thin, but was part of the field that nobody else had quite managed to grab. Outer borough aspirants would be one way of putting it, or people who live lives that are really not focused around Manhattan. And there's a lot of that. And so he comes in the race, sort of picks up that group, and then disappears. And as you're saying, the same numbers dynamic almost immediately asserts itself, as though he hadn't been there. And presumably, I would think he has farther to fall in the polls over the next coming days, over the next few polls that come out. We'll see.
I think one of the events that could help start turning this around, and again, this is, if there's no more revelations, if there's no more new inaccurate statements that get unearthed, if there's, but one of the things that for Weiner that I think he is looking forward to help turn around this narrative, to help turn around what's going on with him, and help stem the downward spiral that this campaign is in, are the time when television ads start appearing and the televised debates. Now, for as many problems as Weiner has had with accomplishing anything during his time in Congress and with providing anything more than great sound bites, rather than policy issues, he's actually a very articulate communicator. That's probably his number one strength. He loves retail campaigning, but he also loves the sort of give and take, verbal jousting that amazingly a lot of New York politicians falter on.
He becomes a front runner in 2005 in a very flat field. Largely through his debate performance, when everyone else comes off as stale, and it's like, hey, here's this one guy with ideas, and the press, which has sort of heard his shtick before, and it's a pretty thin shtick, was not terribly impressed. Just because they had this understanding after the sentences he just said, there wasn't much else there, but voters responded. Voters responded in a pretty remarkable way. So this is a playbook that he has gone to before with real success.
Right. In 2005, the council speaker at the time, Gifford Miller, he got caught in a number of questionable activities in terms of how he was allocating resources from his campaign. I think there was an email even sent out from a council employee encouraging others to work on the campaign, which is a huge no-no, but it also fed into the idea and the narrative that he was a guy who was just using his office in order to run for mayor, and here was one small but clear example of how that was being done. So Gifford was his campaign was stumbling. Virginia Fields, who was an African-American woman, she was Manhattan Borough President, which gave her a strong perch to run for citywide office, and she never really had campaign infrastructure. She was not a candidate who put out many proposals or ideas, and she was not able to communicate any kind of vision or policy idea. And then he had Fernando Ferrer, who looked, he looked somewhat fatigued from the 2001 race, and by the time he got to 2005, he was sort of had a contentious relationship with the media and sort of felt like he was unfairly covered, and he even proposed, I think it was a stock transfer tax, where he proposed it, and then it took him several weeks to even describe where the money would go. So he tax, and then he didn't articulate or clearly state what the money would be used for and where it would go. And what people had very quickly seen was just more tax, and Bloomberg labeled him as a tax spent Democrat.
And so all this opens up this tremendous space for Weiner. But the thing that I think is hard to avoid is that his behavior at this point, not the sex stuff, the lying, or extremely misleading. I can't say he perjured himself in a court sense, and he keeps sort of coming back to that. I never exactly said that I stopped sexting when I left office, but he gave everyone very strongly, clearly, and willfully that impression, with Uma actively helping with that.
And that's...
But I think that's what makes this different from '05. Is that's a serious mark on someone's character and their, more significantly, sort of their self-control. And at this point, him doubling down and saying, "I'm just going to keep running. It's the only thing I know how to do." There's something a little sad about it. There's something slightly superstitious and crazy. And there's a man who's never had a life outside of elected office, really. Who I think is just at ends with how else to spend his time. And what's more, when he has, it's been a little ugly. So in that stretch, when he was resigned from Congress, and he magically found that he was incredibly good at working as a consultant. People just wanted to throw money at him.
Right.
I mean, there's something deeply unappealing about that, to me at least.
Well, right. And what I tried to do is say, you're all focusing on the wrong thing. I've always told you that there was more stuff coming out. And it's not the photographs. It's not what this, what this new woman is saying about how they were in love or whatever it was. It's the fact that, and it's not even the fact that he relapsed, right? Because people go through behavioral problems, addictions, withdrawal, whatever you call it, right? There's a number of stories where people try to correct bad behavior and fall off the wagon. Like, how many times have people tried to, quit smoking and say this is the last one, right? So the big sense, the bigger problem, the reason why Anthony Weiner has such a big problem isn't just because of the relapse, right? Which is bad enough to explain. It's the fact that in interview after interview, when he was saying that this is the truth, I'm a different person, he, in the calm, cool light of day, he clearly chose not to be forthcoming and completely honest. And what snowballed, what happened over time, was that everyone got the same impression, which was that his behavior stopped when he left Congress. And whether he said it directly, he definitely had people believing that, and he knew that was the impression that everyone had. And it is a careless, reckless, and completely... It's hard to explain and justify why he would even create that problem for himself, knowing that there were at least 3 women who had proof that what he was leading everyone to believe was inaccurate.
It's very off-putting, and it's come out that this one of those 3 women, Withers, the one who was sharing information with the dirty, was also on various sugar daddy sites. Right. He was not dealing with the stablest people, or the sort of people you'd say, oh, well, I can trust everyone here to keep a secret.
Right, which you can argue calls into question his judgment. When you're a mayor, you're dealing with any number of business interests, lawmakers, any number of people who you have to gauge are doing things in the best interest of the public. Well, if you can't, be a judge of character in this very obvious setting, it calls into question how well you'll be able to judge people when you're in a room discussing taxes or legislation or some other issues.
So the one major candidate who has not called on Weiner to withdraw, as have various editorial boards, including the Daily News, is Christine Quinn. And this makes a world of sense. As you've been saying, a runoff with Thompson is really tough for her, whereas a runoff with potentially the first woman mayor, the first out gay mayor,
yep.
versus Anthony Weiner, given his sexual and honesty baggage at this point, is, I think, a much more winnable proposition for her. If somehow he could still end up in a runoff, which I continue to have a hard time seeing.
But I don't think her calling on him to drop out or not drop out is a factor in whether or not Weiner makes the runoff. I think there's something slightly different going on there. Is that if Quinn stops talking about Weiner, she loses an opportunity to talk about an issue that helps underscore her status as the first, as the only woman in this mayor's race, as someone who can uniquely speak about women's rights and women's issues, which would galvanize a block of voters that most people assume are going to be turning out in large numbers for her. So the longer Anthony Weiner is a story, the longer Christine Quinn has a great example of someone who highlights an issue that she wants to talk about. So when Anthony Weiner first emerged as a candidate, she wouldn't even say his name. There was they had done a press conference. Christine Quinn had done a press conference announcing the endorsement of 1,000 women shortly after Anthony Weiner and whom did their Sunday New York Times interview. She didn't mention his name, but they were creating the image of contrast. 1,000 women with Christine Quinn, Anthony Weiner, the guy who obviously did stuff that we all know about. Now that he's in this downward spiral, she wants to keep, politically wants to keep his name in the news, wants to keep talking about him. Whether or not she says to drop out or not is slightly immaterial. It's the fact that she releases lengthy statements about him, the fact that she speaks on national television about his problems. That's the thing that is more important to watch. And whether or not Weiner takes away votes from de Blasio or from Thompson heading into the runoff, it's the fact that that Weiner has created a climate where Christine Quinn and her campaign talk about the issue that they want to talk about. That's a winning proposition for her.
So, big picture, this is the widest open mayoral race in a long time. I keep thinking about 77 when you have all these big name Democrats in the race, but there's an incumbent there. Abe Beame is challenged by, among others, Koch and Cuomo. Mm-hmm. There's a broad sense that the city is in for a big moment of shift after 20 years of at least a nominally Republican, certainly not Democrat mayors in right. Giuliani and Bloomberg. Mm-hmm. And the various powers that be that have held their breath for various reasons over that force will reassert themselves. The business community and the Post, to some extent, have been apoplectic about the field and that the bad old days are going to be back upon us and looking for a very long time for some savior to come into the race, which they didn't find. So what is the city going to look like, Azi, a year from now, do you think?
That is a great question, and if I knew, I think I would have struck the lotto at some point earlier in my life and done something else. But I think a year from now, we're going to look back and wonder how a more dominant figure didn't come into the race. Why somebody stronger didn't come in. There's going to be a lot to digest about the election. There's also going to be questions of. There also is, I think, a year after an election, an opportunity where everyone's going to turn around and say, "Why didn't we ask this question about, union contracts, or ask this question about raising revenues and generators?"
Hold on. So, what are the big things? What are the big names? Who are the big names that we've missed? And what are the big things that we've missed? I mean, you've been covering this race in a way that seems almost painful to me. It's been going on for a very long time.
Yes.
It hasn't gone very far. So two things. Like, who are the big people we've missed? What are the issues that could have been part of this race? And what do people who haven't been following this race closely not understand about it that you see having followed these candidates?
I think people that haven't been following this race don't fully appreciate how many times these candidates have been asked in detail, explain where you are going to get money to pay for these union contracts. Municipal labor unions are asking for prospective raises going forward with their new contract, but also retroactive raises to cover the time that in between when their last contract was enforced and the present.
So very quickly, because of basically pattern bargaining, where one union sets the pattern and everyone else follows. And because of their desire to wait out this mayor and this mayor's disinterest in offering a lot at the bargaining table, basically much of the city workforce is now without contract.
Right.
And the way this works in New York, when they get a new contract, some of those terms are also supposed to apply backward for the period in which they've been working without one. So there's this pent-up sense of all this money due, and the question of where that money would come from, especially if at some point, the Fed bubble that's done very well by Wall Street goes away and that tax revenue disappears. So there's sort of a lot of money that may or may not exist that people are already sort of divvying up. Would be one way of seeing it. But
right.
I'm sorry, go on. Yeah.
Oh, and I think a year for an election, every reporter or editor sort of asks, did we dig deep enough? Did we look at this connection between this donor and this candidate? I think also a year from now, if there's not a major change in crime level, if after a year, New York looks the way that it does now, and there's an inspector general or a court monitor or a law sitting on the books that bans racial profiling and opens up the police department and specific officers to lawsuits based on wrongful stops. I think if those are in place and there's not a dramatic change in crime levels, I think a new conversation about policing in New York City begins to emerge, and a lot of the rhetoric from Ray Kelly and Michael Bloomberg gets called into question, and a lot of histrionics that have been part of the policing debate get called into question. But also, conversely, if the New York City public schools look much the way they do now, that also starts to become a problem for the next mayor, as does the problem with homelessness and the access to affordable housing. I think if certain things stay the same, public schools, affordable housing, those become problems for the mayor, and people start to wonder why was this a bigger problem for Michael Bloomberg. And if crime stays the same,
politely saying that that some of the claims about the success of the schools under this mayor, who was the first mayor to have had direct control over them, are pretty clearly significantly less than advertised. The number of homeless people has gone up since 2001 substantially, and this mayor is not taking a tremendous amount of heat for that, but the next one is likely to. On the crime front, there's also the question of how accurate the numbers are, which is something that's also come up with education. And you can stretch that too hard, and nobody thinks, say, the murder rate is cooked, or nobody at all serious. But once you get past this sort of silly stop and frisk debate, which I call silly because a lot of this involves how paperwork and numbers are put down rather than how the department's actually behaving, which is why this mayor's claims of apocalypse, if that policy should shift, seem, blood in the streets, seem fairly absurd. But for the next mayor, if, say, the burglary rate is in fact 15% higher than is presently reported, because crimes get downshifted when people go to precincts, because citizens are discouraged from reporting them, and so on.
Right.
It's an open question how the tabloids in particular will respond to a Democratic mayor, potentially a black mayor. Even if the city is reasonably safe and orderly at that point, just trying to get the numbers back to where they actually are. So there could potentially be a rise in the crime rate without a rise in crime that could be very politically difficult for the next mayor to handle, especially if some parts of the city want to create pressure there.
Right.
I think fair to say.
Yes, and the other thing that's going to be fascinating to watch is where Ray Kelly goes. There was a report by one news outlet, DNA Info, where Murray Weiss is writing. He's a former New York Post crime reporter. And he had floated the idea that if Ray Kelly doesn't go to the Department of Homeland Security, he could end up with a job as an analyst for, wait for it, News Corp and the New York Post and Fox News parent company. Mm-hmm. So if you have Ray Kelly, who has a sterling record nationally, he's a voice that people listen to and respect. They don't always agree with, but he definitely is a person whose opinions would be taken very seriously. If he is given a platform with which to speak, and there's an issue of crime reporting versus actual crime in actuality, as you point out, if that's a problem that the current mayor is dealing with, and you have a voice like Ray Kelly given an outlet with which to sort of make his commentary, you have an incredible challenge for the next mayor that Michael Bloomberg has not had to face. Bill Bratton has not weighed in on New York City crime issues. He was busy being the police commissioner out in Los Angeles, and now he's sort of in the private sector. And
now he doesn't want to talk because he might end up being the commissioner again in a very, very weird, very extended back and forth between Kelly and Bratton, who are not personally so fond of each other.
Right. But Bratton has seemed to lay the blame for stop and frisk and a lot of the police problems on Bloomberg's feet by saying he shrunk the police force too much, and Ray Kelly has sort of had to manage unrealistic expectations with a diminutive police force, which is unfair. But if you have Ray Kelly given an outlet with which to sort of comment on the state of policing in New York City, where the crime statistics are going up, you have a real problem for the next mayor. And a year from now, we all could be debating the very thing that you just pointed out. Is the crime reporting just more accurately reflecting what's going on, or is there an actual increase in crime?
That will be interesting. So let's leave it with one related question, which is Bloomberg has now been mayor for 12 years. Kelly's been the commissioner for those full 12 years. He's the longest serving commissioner by far in New York history. He was also briefly the commissioner under Dinkins.
Yep.
But just these 12 years would get him up to number one. Bloomberg is racing furiously to sort of establish enough facts on the ground, legacy items as he can in the time he has remaining. But how much of a shadow is he going to cast in terms of money, which he's showered on the city for over a decade now, and political influence once he's out of office, or is his attention at that point going to be elsewhere? And to what extent does this depend on whether or not it's Quinn or someone else who's mayor?
I think it depends on who the next mayor is and how aggressively do they move to start undoing what he considers his legacy and accomplishments. Remember, when Michael Bloomberg first came into office, one of the things he did was cancel contracts for the new Yankee Stadium and the stadium for the Mets. Now, that was something that people thought Rudy Giuliani would be apoplectic about, and there was some tension right there. But clearly, that has not had a long-lasting problem. That didn't create a long-lasting problem for the two. They have disagreements on things, but in public, they get along and agree a lot more than they disagree. So
they had some sort of accommodation, and if it's not Quinn, Bloomberg won't have that with the next mayor.
Right.
But he lives here. He has a foundation that has spent a lot of money on New York issues, and as it started shutting that spigot down as he's leaving and no longer needs that money to sort of grease the political process. But he's very concerned with his legacy. He's very concerned with his education accomplishments, on paper at least. I'm just interested in your take on how that plays out if he has someone who's not an ally and someone who doesn't have an accommodation with coming in after, as with Kelly.
Right. Well, what he is going to have, even if he cuts off his financial spigot to a number of host organizations who then act as free agents, there are a number of people who have cycled in and out of the Bloomberg administration who are New York City residents, who are political operatives, the professional chattering class, if you will. And those people also have a built-in interest in seeing exactly, Bloomberg's legacy and their own legacies kept in place. And remember, it's very easy to talk about Michael Bloomberg and his own personal ambition and what he's done to sort of make his name synonymous with success in New York. But there's been countless other people who've signed on to it and agreed to it. Any number of Democratic operatives who've crossed party lines and worked for him against members of their own party, and Republican operatives who, for years, didn't really have a chance to have this powerful a force behind them in accomplishing what they wanted. So whether or not Bloomberg himself actively plays a role, you have to remember, there's now going to be 12 years' worth of operatives who are going to be in New York City, who informally and formally are going to be operating as if they're protecting something that they spent over a decade working on and that they're very proud of.
What's incredible is 12 years of operatives, and yet no, Bloomberg didn't build a Republican or independent party. He didn't groom a successor. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right. At the operative level, which is important, and can do a lot to inform policy. He's created something that will last after he's gone, even without his money to help with that process. But in terms of actual politicians or other elected officials, he's literally been a one-man show. And that's why it's going to be so interesting to see where New York is at when he finally cedes the stage.
It's going to be fascinating to watch, New York City without Michael Bloomberg in charge, but New York City with Michael Bloomberg still at the East Side Townhouse.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we should leave it there. Azi, thanks for taking the time.
No, thanks for having me.